The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Buckingham. Palace's officer James Whitmore began his routine patrol. He had served the royal household for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never questioned an order or stepped out of line. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, his discretion legendary among his fellow guards. But on this particular Tuesday in late autumn, everything he thought he knew about duty and honor would be tested in ways he never imagined. James had noticed something peculiar over the past 3 weeks. Late at night, when the palace should have been silent and still, he heard movements coming from the Queen Consort's private chambers. Footsteps echoed through the hallways at odd hours, and on 2 occasions, he had seen palace staff carrying large fabric bundles through service corridors that were rarely used. When he mentioned this to his supervisor, he was told to mind his own business and focus on his assigned duties. The royal household had been in a state of quiet tension since the coronation 6 months earlier. Staff members whispered in corners. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain people entered rooms, and there was an unmistakable atmosphere of secrets being carefully guarded. James tried to ignore the growing unease in his gut, but years of training had taught him to trust his instincts. Something was not right within these ancient walls. It started with a phone call that came through to the security office at 6 in the morning. The voice on the other end belonged to Lady Margaret Thornbury, a senior member of the royal household who had served Queen Elizabeth II for over 30 years. Her tone was urgent, almost frantic, which was entirely unlike her usual composed demeanor. She requested an immediate meeting with the head of palace security, insisting that it could not wait even 1 more hour. James was assigned to escort Lady Margaret to the security chief's office. As they walked through the quiet corridors, he could see that her hands were trembling slightly. Her face, usually serene and dignified, was pale and drawn. She clutched a small leather notebook against her chest, as if it contained the most precious secrets in the world. When they reached the office, she asked James to remain outside and stand guard, ensuring that no one disturbed their conversation. For nearly 2 hours, James stood at attention outside that door. He could hear raised voices inside, though he could not make out the words. At one point, he heard what sounded like Lady Margaret crying, which shocked him deeply. She was known throughout the palace as a woman of iron composure, who never showed emotion, no matter the circumstances. Whatever she had revealed in that meeting was clearly devastating. When the door finally opened, the security chief emerged with a grim expression. He looked at James with an intensity that made the guard straighten his posture even more. The chief informed him that he was being temporarily reassigned to special duties, and that he was to report to a private briefing room immediately. No explanations were offered, and James knew better than to ask questions. In the royal household, information was shared on a strict need-to-know basis. The briefing room was small and windowless, located in one of the older sections of the palace. Waiting inside were 3 other guards whom James knew and trusted, along with 2 members of the royal household management team. The security chief entered last, closing the door firmly behind him and locking it. The gravity of the situation was evident in every face present. The chief began by reminding everyone, in the room of their oath of loyalty and their duty to protect the crown and its legacy, he spoke about the importance of preserving royal history and ensuring that items of national significance remained safeguarded for future generations. Then he revealed something that made James's blood run cold. An inventory check of the royal collection had uncovered a disturbing discrepancy. Several items belonging to the late Queen Elizabeth II were missing from their designated storage locations. These were not minor trinkets or forgotten curiosities. The missing items included pieces of immense historical and sentimental value. Among them was a ceremonial robe that Queen Elizabeth II had worn during important state occasions, jewelry that had been passed down through generations of monarchs, and several personal items that held deep meaning for the royal family. The discovery had been made during a routine audit, but the implications were anything but routine. Lady Margaret had come forward with additional information that painted an even more troubling picture. She had personally inventoried Queen Elizabeth's possessions after her passing, following protocols that had been established decades earlier. Every item had been carefully catalogued, photographed, and placed in secure storage with multiple locks and security measures. The system was designed to be foolproof. requiring authorization from several high-ranking officials before anything could be removed. Yet somehow, items had disappeared. Lady Margaret had noticed inconsistencies 3 weeks earlier, but had initially assumed there had been administrative errors or that items had been temporarily relocated for conservation work. However, as she investigated further, she discovered that no official paperwork existed for the removal of these items. No conservation work had been scheduled. No transfers had been authorized. The items had simply vanished. What made the situation even more suspicious was the timing. The disappearances had occurred in the weeks following the coronation, during a period when new protocols were being established and old systems were being reorganized. It was the perfect time for someone to exploit the confusion and chaos that naturally accompanies such a major transition. Whoever had taken these items had clearly planned carefully and understood the palace systems intimately. James felt his stomach tighten as the security chief continued. Lady Margaret had been conducting her own discreet investigation over the past 2 weeks, speaking quietly with trusted staff members and reviewing security footage. What she had discovered led to one person, someone who had both the access and the opportunity to remove items from secure storage. The trail pointed directly to someone within Queen Consort Camilla's inner circle. The chief was careful with his words, emphasizing that no accusations were being made against the Queen Consort herself. However, the evidence suggested that someone very close to her, someone with regular access to her private apartments, was involved in the disappearance of the late Queen's possessions. The situation was diplomatically explosive. Any investigation involving the Queen Consort required the utmost discretion and careful handling. This was where James and his fellow guards came into the picture. They were being tasked with a mission that required absolute secrecy and unwavering loyalty. Under the authority of senior palace officials and with the discreet approval of King Charles himself, they were to conduct a search of specific areas within the palace. The search would need to be done carefully, respectfully, and without causing any public scandal or embarrassment to the royal family. The security chief laid out a detailed plan. They had obtained information suggesting that some of the missing items might be hidden within the Queen Consort's private wardrobes and storage areas. These rooms were considered her personal domain, rarely accessed by anyone except her most trusted staff members. Conducting a search there would be unprecedented and potentially career-ending if handled improperly. But the stakes were too high to ignore the evidence. James was chosen to lead the search. Because of his reputation for discretion and his years of unblemished service, the chief handed him a master key that would open most doors in the palace, along with specific authorization documents that bore the seal of the Lord Chamberlain's office. He was told that the search must be conducted the following morning, when the Queen Consort would be away from the palace attending a charity event. Timing was critical. That night, James barely slept. He kept thinking about what he had been asked to do. Opening the Queen Consort's private wardrobes felt like a violation of trust, even with official authorization. He thought about Queen Elizabeth II, whom he had occasionally seen during his years of service. She had always carried herself with such dignity and grace. The idea that her personal possessions might have been stolen and hidden away was deeply disturbing. He also thought about the consequences if the search revealed nothing. His career would likely survive due to the official authorization, but the embarrassment to the Queen Consort could create lasting tensions within the palace. On the other hand, if they found the missing items, the scandal would be enormous. Either way, James knew that his life was about to change dramatically. The next morning arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that rattled the palace windows. James met with his small team in the security office, and they reviewed the plan one final time. They would enter the Queen Consort's apartments through a service entrance, conduct their search systematically and respectfully, and document everything they found. If they discovered any of the missing items, they were to secure them immediately and report directly to the security chief. As the Queen Consort's motorcade departed through the palace gates, James and his team moved into position. They walked through the elegant corridors that led to her private apartments, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the palace itself understood the significance of what was about to happen. When they reached the ornate doors to her chambers, James took a deep breath and inserted the master key into the lock. The door opened smoothly, and silently. Inside, the apartments were beautifully decorated with antique furniture, fine artwork, and personal photographs. Everything was arranged perfectly, reflecting the taste and style of their royal occupant. James felt like an intruder, but he pushed those feelings aside and focused on his duty. The team spread out according to plan, each person assigned to search specific areas. James headed toward the main wardrobe room, a large chamber lined with custom-built closets and storage units. The room smelled faintly of lavender and expensive perfume. Rows of elegant gowns hung in careful arrangement. Shoes were displayed on specialized racks, and accessories were organized in glass-fronted drawers. It was clear that everything had its place, maintained by staff who took pride in their work. He began his search methodically, checking each closet and storage unit according to the inventory list he had been given. Most contained exactly what would be expected: clothing, shoes, handbags, and jewelry boxes. Nothing seemed out of place or suspicious. As he worked his way through the room, James started to wonder if their intelligence had been wrong. Perhaps the missing items were somewhere else entirely. Then he reached the final wardrobe at the far end of the room. It was older than the others, made of dark wood with ornate carvings that suggested it was a genuine antique. Unlike the other closets, which opened easily, this one was locked. James tried his master key, but it did not fit. He examined the lock more closely and realized it had been recently changed. A modern high-security lock had been installed in the antique door, which seemed oddly out of place. His instincts told him this was significant. Why would one wardrobe be specially locked when all the others opened freely? He radioed his team leader and requested authorization to force the lock. After a brief consultation, permission was granted. James retrieved specialized tools from his equipment bag and began working on the lock. His hands were steady despite his racing heartbeat. The lock proved more difficult than expected, requiring nearly 20 minutes of careful manipulation. Finally, he heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. James stood back and looked at the wardrobe door for a long moment. Whatever was inside had been deliberately hidden and protected. He reached forward, grasped the ornate handle, and slowly pulled the door open. What he saw inside made him freeze in shock, his mind struggling to process the implications of his discovery. Inside the locked wardrobe, carefully wrapped in protective silk cloth, hung the most magnificent garment James had ever seen. The fabric shimmered even in the dim light of the wardrobe room, threads of gold and silver woven into deep purple velvet. He recognized it immediately from photographs and historical records. This was Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe, one of the most significant pieces of royal regalia in British history. It should have been in the secure royal collection vault, protected by multiple layers of security and climate control systems. Instead, it was hidden in a locked wardrobe in the Queen Consort's private apartments. James felt his hands begin to shake slightly as the full weight of this discovery settled on him. This was not just any stolen item. This was a piece of living history, worn by Queen Elizabeth II during one of the most important moments of her reign. The robe represented the continuity of the British monarchy, the sacred oath of duty and service that each monarch takes. Finding it here, hidden away like some guilty secret, felt like a betrayal of everything the royal family was supposed to represent. He carefully pulled back more of the silk wrapping to examine the robe fully. It was in perfect condition, showing no signs of damage or neglect. Someone had taken great care to preserve it properly, which suggested this was not a random act of theft, but something planned and deliberate. The robe had been removed from its proper place and hidden here for a specific reason. But what reason could possibly justify taking such a historically significant item? James immediately radioed his team leader, keeping his voice calm and professional despite his inner turmoil. Within minutes, 2 other guards arrived at the wardrobe room, followed shortly by the security chief himself. The chief's face grew pale when he saw the coronation robe. He stood silently for a long moment, then ordered the area to be secured and photographed before anything was moved. This discovery had just elevated their investigation to a level none of them had fully anticipated. As the team documented the scene, James continued searching the rest of the wardrobe. Behind the coronation robe, he found additional items wrapped in similar silk cloth. There was a diamond tiara that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, several pieces of jewelry that matched descriptions on the missing items list, and a collection of personal letters and photographs. Each discovery added another layer to the mystery. Why had these items been taken? Who had authorized their removal, if anyone? And most importantly, what had been the intention behind hiding them here? The security chief made several phone calls from a secure line, speaking in hushed tones to individuals whose identities James could only guess at. The chief's expression grew increasingly grave with each conversation. After the final call, he gathered the team and explained that they needed to expand their search. If the Coronation Robe was here, there might be other significant items hidden elsewhere in the apartments. They were to be thorough, but quick. As the Queen Consort would return to the palace in approximately 3 hours, the team split up again. This time, with heightened alertness and a better sense of what they were looking for. James moved to an adjoining room that served as a private sitting area. It was elegantly furnished with antique chairs, a writing desk, and built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. He began checking the desk drawers, finding nothing unusual at first, just stationery pens and routine correspondence. Then he noticed something odd about one of the bookshelves. The books on one particular shelf seemed slightly dusty compared to the others, as if they had not been touched in some time. Yet when James looked more closely, he could see fresh fingerprints in the dust on several of the spines. Someone had been handling these books recently but had deliberately made it appear otherwise. He pulled one of the books forward and heard a soft clicking sound. The entire bookshelf was actually a concealed door. The hidden door swung open to reveal a small storage space built into the wall. Inside were 2 locked boxes made of polished wood with brass fittings. James's heart pounded as he carefully removed the boxes and placed them on the desk. Using his tools again, he opened the first box. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, were several more pieces of jewelry belonging to the late Queen. There were brooches, rings, and a magnificent necklace of pearls and diamonds that he recognized from official portraits. The second box contained documents. James carefully examined them without removing anything from the box. There were certificates of authenticity for various pieces of jewelry, insurance documents, and what appeared to be correspondence between palace officials regarding the transfer and storage of royal possessions. Some of these documents had dates from shortly after Queen Elizabeth's passing. James photographed everything with his secure camera and immediately notified the security chief of this new discovery. The atmosphere in the apartments had become increasingly tense. Each new discovery raised more questions than it answered. The items had clearly been taken systematically over a period of weeks or months. The level of access required, combined with knowledge of palace security systems, suggested this was not the work of a casual thief. This had been carefully planned and executed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and who had the authority to move freely through restricted areas. As James continued his search, he found himself thinking about the implications beyond just the theft itself. If these items had been taken deliberately, what was the motivation? The Coronation Robe and Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry were priceless, but they would be impossible to sell. They were too recognizable, too historically significant. No legitimate collector or museum would touch them. So if the motive was not financial gain, what else could it be? One of the other guards called out from another room. He had discovered a locked cabinet in what appeared to be a private dressing area. When they forced it open, they found more items from the royal collection, including several pieces of ceremonial regalia that should have been in secure storage. There were also personal items that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth, a favorite handbag, some of her private correspondence, and several pieces of costume jewelry that, while not valuable in monetary terms, held immense sentimental significance. The security chief arrived to examine these new findings. His expression had shifted from shock to anger. He pulled James aside and spoke quietly but firmly. The situation had escalated beyond anything they had initially anticipated. The sheer volume of missing items found in these apartments suggested systematic removal over an extended period. This was not someone acting on impulse or taking a few small items as keepsakes. This was deliberate, organized, and extensive. James asked the question that had been troubling him since they found the Coronation Robe. "Sir, do you think the Queen Consort knows these items are here?" The security chief's expression was unreadable. He responded carefully, reminding James that they were gathering evidence, not jumping to conclusions. However, he acknowledged that the location of the items raised serious questions that would need to be answered by people well above their pay grade. The team continued their search, now working with increased urgency as time ticked away. In a small storage closet, they found several garment bags containing more of Queen Elizabeth's clothing. These were not ceremonial robes or formal gowns, but everyday items, cardigans, skirts, and dresses that the late Queen had worn during private moments. Finding these items felt particularly invasive as they represented intimate aspects of her daily life. Why would anyone want to take and hide such personal belongings? As James carefully examined each garment bag, he noticed something tucked into the pocket of one of the cardigans. It was a small handwritten note on palace stationery. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and it appeared to be instructions for someone named Sarah regarding the discreet relocation of items for safekeeping. The note was dated 3 weeks after Queen Elizabeth's funeral. James photographed the note and added it to the growing collection of evidence. In another room, one of the guards discovered a locked trunk beneath a window seat. The trunk was old but well-maintained, with brass corners and a faded royal crest on its lid. When they opened it, they found it filled with photograph albums, personal journals, and memorabilia from Queen Elizabeth's long reign. These items were irreplaceable, representing decades of royal history and personal memories. They should have been preserved in the royal archives, available for historians and future generations, not hidden away in a private trunk. The discoveries kept coming, each one adding to the mounting evidence. They found more jewelry, including pieces that had belonged to other members of the royal family. They found official documents and certificates. They found personal items that ranged from valuable antiques to simple objects that held purely sentimental value. The collection was extensive and carefully curated, suggesting that whoever had assembled it had specific knowledge of the royal collection and knew exactly which items to take. As the search continued, James noticed something interesting about the pattern of items they were finding. Many of them were things that Queen Elizabeth II had been photographed wearing or using during her final years. There were her favorite brooches, her preferred style of handbags, clothing she had worn to important events. It was as if someone had been systematically collecting pieces of her public and private life, preserving them in a way that kept them separate from the official royal collection. The security chief received another phone call, and after a brief conversation, he gathered the team together. They had been granted permission to search one final area, the Queen Consort's private bedroom. This was an even more sensitive location, requiring additional authorization and absolute discretion. The chief emphasized that they needed to be extremely respectful and careful in this space. Any mistakes or oversights could have severe diplomatic consequences. James led the way into the bedroom, which was elegantly decorated in soft colors with expensive furnishings and artwork. The room felt very personal, filled with photographs of family members and personal mementos. He felt like an intruder being in such a private space, but his duty compelled him forward. The team worked quickly and carefully, checking closets, drawers, and storage areas. At first, the bedroom search revealed nothing suspicious. Everything appeared normal and appropriate for a royal residence. James was beginning to think this room would not yield any additional discoveries when one of his colleagues noticed something unusual about a large wardrobe that stood against the far wall. The wardrobe appeared to be built-in, but when examined closely, there was a small gap between it and the wall that should not have existed if it were truly built-in. Working together, the guards carefully pulled the wardrobe away from the wall. Behind it was a small door that had been completely concealed. The door was locked with a modern electronic lock that required a code. This was sophisticated security for what appeared to be just a storage space. The security chief made another phone call, and within minutes, a specialist arrived with equipment to bypass the electronic lock. When the door finally opened, James found himself looking at what appeared to be a small private vault. The space was climate-controlled and equipped with proper lighting and security measures. Inside, displayed on custom stands and shelving, was a collection that took his breath away. There was Queen Elizabeth II's coronation crown, glittering with precious stones. There were royal scepters and orbs that should have been in the Tower of London. There were pieces of jewelry so significant that they were part of Britain's national heritage. But what truly shocked James was what occupied the central position in this hidden vault. Mounted on a special stand, illuminated by subtle lighting, was Queen Elizabeth II's complete coronation outfit. Not just the robe they had found earlier, but the entire ensemble she had worn during her 1953 coronation ceremony. The dress, the accessories, every element was there, preserved in perfect condition. This was not just theft. This was the systematic removal of some of the most significant items in British royal history. The security chief stood in stunned silence, his face reflecting the magnitude of what they had discovered. This was no longer just an investigation into missing items. They had uncovered what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to create a private collection of Queen Elizabeth II's most significant possessions. Hidden away in the apartments of the current queen consort, the implications were staggering, and the questions they raised would shake the foundations of the royal household. The security chief immediately ordered the hidden vault to be sealed and placed under guard. He made a series of urgent phone calls, speaking directly to the highest levels of palace administration. Within 30 minutes, several senior officials arrived at the queen consort's apartments, their faces grave and worried. James and his team were instructed to remain in place and speak to no one about what they had discovered. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple investigation into missing items. As palace officials examined the hidden vault and its contents, James stood guard in the corridor outside. He could hear tense voices through the door, though he could not make out specific words. The officials were clearly struggling with how to handle this unprecedented situation. The items they had discovered were not just valuable possessions, but symbols of British monarchy and national heritage. Their presence in this hidden vault raised questions that went to the very heart of royal protocol and tradition. Lady Margaret arrived an hour later, escorted by 2 members of the palace legal team. She looked even more distressed than she had that morning when she first brought her concerns to the security office. James watched as she entered the apartments and was taken directly to the hidden vault. He heard her gasp of shock when she saw the coronation ensemble, followed by what sounded like quiet sobbing. For someone who had dedicated her life to serving the royal family, this discovery must have felt like a personal betrayal. The legal team began documenting everything with meticulous care. Photographers were brought in to capture every angle of the hidden vault and its contents. Each item was cataloged and compared against official inventory records. The process took hours, and as the afternoon wore on, the reality of the situation became increasingly clear. Nearly 50 significant items belonging to Queen Elizabeth. 2 had been removed from their proper places and hidden in these apartments. The systematic nature of the theft was undeniable. James was eventually called into the main sitting room to give a detailed statement about how he had discovered the various hiding places. He explained his search methodology, the locked wardrobes, the concealed bookshelf door, and finally, the hidden vault behind the wardrobe. As he spoke, several officials took extensive notes, and his testimony was recorded on video. The chief legal advisor asked him repeatedly whether he had touched or moved anything unnecessarily, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the integrity of the evidence. During his statement, James was asked a question that had been troubling him throughout the entire search. Did he believe that the queen consort was personally aware that these items were hidden in her apartments? It was a delicate question, one that he had been carefully avoiding thinking about too directly. He answered honestly that he did not know, but he noted that the hidden vault had been concealed with considerable sophistication and required an electronic code to access. One with significant resources and knowledge had created that space deliberately. As evening approached, word came that the queen consort's schedule had been adjusted. She would not be returning to the palace that day, but would instead be staying overnight at Clarence House. The official explanation given to her staff was that urgent maintenance work needed to be completed in her apartments. James understood this was a diplomatic way of keeping her away, while officials decided how to handle the situation. The palace was buying itself time to formulate a response to this crisis. The team was finally released from duty late that evening, but not before each member was individually briefed about the absolute necessity of maintaining complete confidentiality. They were informed that any discussion of what they had discovered, even among themselves, would be considered a serious breach of security and could result in immediate dismissal and potential legal action. The officials signed a formal non-disclosure agreement, and each was reminded of the oath they had taken when they joined the royal guard. James walked through the dark palace corridors toward the guard quarters, his mind racing with everything he had witnessed that day. He thought about Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned with such dignity and dedication for so many decades. He thought about these precious items that represented her life and legacy, hidden away like guilty secrets. He thought about what this discovery might mean for the royal family and the monarchy itself. The implications were almost too large to fully comprehend. That night, James barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coronation robe hanging in that locked wardrobe, or the glittering crown displayed in the hidden vault. He wondered who had taken these items, and why. He wondered whether it had been done with the Queen Consort's knowledge, or without it. He wondered how King Charles would react when he was fully briefed on what had been discovered in his wife's apartments. The questions seemed endless, and none of them had easy answers. The next morning, James reported for duty and found the palace in a state of barely contained tension. Staff members moved through their routines with forced normalcy, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in every interaction. Rumors had apparently begun circulating despite the efforts at secrecy. People knew that something significant had happened, even if they did not know the specific details. The palace rumor mill was notoriously efficient, and trying to keep something this big completely quiet was nearly impossible. James was summoned to a meeting with the security chief and several palace officials he had not met before. They informed him that he would be temporarily reassigned to special security detail and would be working directly with the investigation team. His primary responsibility would be maintaining the security of the evidence they had collected and ensuring that no one accessed the Queen Consort's apartments without proper authorization. It was a role that required absolute trustworthiness, and they had chosen him specifically because of his performance during the search. Over the following days, James learned more about how the investigation was unfolding. Forensic experts had been brought in to examine the items for fingerprints and other evidence. Security footage from the weeks and months after Queen Elizabeth's death was being carefully reviewed. Staff members who had access to both the secure storage areas and the Queen Consort's apartments were being quietly interviewed. The investigation was being conducted with utmost discretion, but it was thorough and comprehensive. Lady Margaret proved to be a crucial source of information. She had worked closely with Queen Elizabeth II for decades and knew every detail of the royal collection. She was able to identify not just what had been taken, but also when each item had last been seen in its proper place. Her records were meticulous, showing a clear pattern of disappearances that began approximately 2 weeks after Queen Elizabeth's funeral and continued for several months. The timeline was significant, as it coincided with the period when new protocols were being established for the king's reign. The investigation also revealed something else that James found disturbing. Several junior staff members had apparently noticed irregularities but had been discouraged from reporting them. When they mentioned seeing items being moved or noticed discrepancies in inventory records, they were told not to worry about it or that senior staff were handling the situation. In at least 2 cases, staff members who persisted with their questions were quietly transferred to different departments. Someone had been actively suppressing any inquiries that might have led to earlier discovery of the missing items. James was present when investigators interviewed Sarah Mitchell, senior lady-in-waiting who worked closely with the Queen Consort. Sarah was a composed woman in her late 50s who had served the royal family for over 20 years. During her interview, she appeared nervous and defensive. When asked about the note that James had found in the cardigan pocket, the note that mentioned discreet relocation of items for safekeeping, Sarah initially claimed she had no memory of writing such a note. However, when confronted with handwriting analysis that matched her distinctive style, her composure finally cracked. Sarah admitted that she had been involved in moving items from secure storage to the Queen Consort's apartments. However, she insisted she had been acting on direct instructions and had believed she was following proper protocols. When pressed about whose instructions she had been following, Sarah became evasive, saying only that she had been told the items needed to be kept safe and that their relocation had been authorized at the highest levels. She refused to name who had given her these instructions, claiming she feared for her position if she revealed too much. The investigators were not satisfied with Sarah's testimony. They continued to press her, pointing out that the items she helped relocate included some of the most significant pieces of royal heritage. The Coronation Robe alone was a national treasure. Moving such items without proper documentation and oversight was a serious breach of protocol, regardless of who had authorized it. Eventually, Sarah requested legal counsel, and the interview was suspended. But her admission that she had physically moved the items was a significant breakthrough in the investigation. As the investigation continued, James noticed increasing activity around Clarence's house, where the Queen Consort was still staying. Official cars came and went at odd hours. Lawyers and palace officials were seen entering through side entrances. The Queen Consort had canceled several public appearances, with her office citing minor illness. But palace insiders knew something much more significant was happening behind the scenes. The investigation had clearly reached the highest levels of the royal household. James was on duty one evening when he overheard a conversation between two senior officials in a corridor. They were discussing whether King Charles had been informed about the full extent of what had been discovered. One official expressed concern about how this would affect the king's relationship with his wife. The other responded that His Majesty had been fully briefed and was deeply troubled by the situation, but was determined to handle it with discretion and dignity. The conversation ended when they noticed James standing nearby, and both officials quickly moved away. The media had begun showing unusual interest in royal activities, though they clearly did not know the specific details of what was happening. Several journalists had filed inquiries about why certain sections of Buckingham Palace were temporarily closed for maintenance. Others had noticed the Queen Consort's absence from public events and were beginning to speculate about possible health issues or family tensions. The palace press office was working overtime to manage these inquiries and maintain the appearance of normalcy. James was eventually given access to some of the findings from the forensic investigation. The fingerprint analysis had revealed that multiple people had handled the items in the hidden vault. But the most frequently found prints belonged to Sarah Mitchell and two other staff members who worked directly for the Queen Consort. Interestingly, no fingerprints belonging to the Queen Consort herself were found on any of the items. Though this did not necessarily mean she had no knowledge of their presence in her apartments, the security footage review had produced some illuminating results. Cameras had captured Sarah and her colleagues moving large packages through service corridors late at night, usually when most of the palace staff had gone home. The packages were carefully wrapped and handled with obvious care, consistent with valuable items being relocated. The footage also showed these same staff members accessing the Queen Consort's apartments at times when she was known to be away from the palace, suggesting they had independent access to the rooms. One particularly revealing piece of footage showed a conversation between Sarah and another lady-in-waiting in a corridor outside the Queen Consort's apartments. Although there was no audio, their body language and expressions suggested they were discussing something sensitive. The other woman appeared to be expressing concerns or objections, while Sarah seemed to be reassuring her or giving her instructions. This footage was taken just 2 days before one of the largest transfers of items from secure storage to the apartments. The investigation team was working to identify everyone who had been involved in the systematic removal of Queen Elizabeth's possessions. They had created a detailed timeline showing exactly when each item had been taken, who had access to the storage areas at those times, and who had been present in the Queen Consort's apartments when the items were hidden. The pattern that emerged showed careful coordination among several staff members, all of whom worked closely with the Queen Consort's household. As more evidence accumulated, the central question remained unanswered. What had been the motivation behind taking these items? Financial gain seemed unlikely, as the items could never be sold legally. If the goal had been to preserve the items, they were already insecure. Climate-controlled storage designed specifically for that purpose. Some investigators theorized that someone had wanted to create a private collection of Queen Elizabeth's most significant possessions, perhaps as a way of maintaining a connection to the beloved late Queen. but this explanation did not fully account for the secrecy and deception involved. Lady Margaret offered another theory during one of her consultations with the investigators. She suggested that perhaps someone had felt that these items, particularly the more personal ones, should not be part of the official royal collection, but should instead remain with family. She noted that there had been some tension during the initial inventory process after Queen Elizabeth's death, with disagreements about which items should be preserved for historical purposes and which should be distributed among family members. Perhaps someone had decided to resolve those tensions by simply taking certain items and keeping them separate. James found himself thinking about this theory during his long hours, standing guard outside the Queen Consort's sealed apartments. If Lady Margaret was right, then the person behind this had not seen themselves as a thief, but as a protector of family heritage. They might have genuinely believed they were doing the right thing by keeping these items within the immediate family circle rather than letting them become historical artifacts. It was a perspective that made the situation more complex and more troubling, as it suggested good intentions that had led to terrible decisions. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, James was summoned to a highly confidential meeting in one of the palace's most secure conference rooms. Present were the security chief, several senior palace officials, Lady Margaret, and 2 individuals he immediately recognized as members of King Charles's private staff. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with tension and unspoken concerns. Everyone present understood that decisions made in this meeting would have lasting consequences for the monarchy. The senior palace official began by summarizing the investigation's findings. They had identified 5 staff members who had been directly involved in removing items from secure storage and relocating them to the Queen Consort's apartments. Sarah Mitchell had emerged as the primary coordinator of these activities. Acting on instructions she claimed came from someone in authority. However, despite extensive interviews, Sarah had refused to identify who had given her those instructions. She maintained that she had been following proper protocols and had believed she was acting in the royal family's best interests. The investigation had also uncovered correspondence between Sarah and a private secretary, who had briefly worked for the Queen Consort before leaving the position under unclear circumstances. This correspondence referenced the need to preserve Her late Majesty's legacy in appropriate hands and discussed logistics of discreetly securing items of personal significance. The language used was careful and oblique, but the meaning was clear. Someone had orchestrated a systematic plan to remove Queen Elizabeth's possessions from official storage. What made the situation particularly delicate was the complete absence of any direct evidence linking the Queen Consort herself to these activities. No emails, letters, or recorded conversations showed her requesting or authorizing the removal of items. The staff members involved insisted they had acted independently, motivated by what they believed to be her unspoken wishes and desires. It was a situation that allowed for multiple interpretations, none of which were satisfactory from a legal or ethical standpoint. Lady Margaret spoke next, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She had known Queen Elizabeth II personally for 3 decades and understood better than anyone what these items meant. The Coronation Robe represented not just a piece of clothing, but the sacred commitment the late Queen had made to serve her country. The jewelry pieces carried memories of state occasions, diplomatic visits, and personal milestones. The personal items like clothing and photographs were irreplaceable connections to a woman who had shaped British history. Finding them hidden away felt like an attempt to erase or control that legacy. One of King Charles's private secretaries then provided insight into how the king was viewing the situation. His Majesty was deeply distressed by what had been discovered, but was determined to handle the matter with the dignity and discretion that his mother would have expected. He recognized that a public scandal would damage the monarchy at a time when it needed stability and continuity. However, he was also committed to ensuring that his mother's possessions were returned to their proper place and that appropriate. Measures were taken to prevent such a situation from occurring. Again, the central question that dominated the meeting was what should be done about the Queen Consort. Several possibilities were discussed, each with significant implications. One option was to treat this as a staff matter, dealing with the individuals who had physically moved the items, while avoiding any direct confrontation with the queen consort. Another option was to request a private meeting between the king and queen consort, to discuss what had happened and determine her level of knowledge or involvement. The most drastic option, mentioned only briefly, was to recommend that she move to different apartments entirely. Though everyone recognized this would inevitably attract media attention and speculation, James listened to these discussions with a growing sense of how complex and politically sensitive the situation truly was. The officials were not just dealing with stolen property, but with the relationship between the king and his wife, the public perception of the monarchy, and the delicate balance of power and protocol within the royal household. Every decision had to be weighed not just on its legal or ethical merits, but on its potential impact on the institution of monarchy itself. The security chief raised a practical concern that James had also been considering. The hidden vault behind the wardrobe had been constructed with considerable sophistication and expense. The climate control system, the electronic locks, and the custom displays all required professional installation and ongoing maintenance. Someone had paid for this work, and there should be records of those payments. If they could trace the financial trail, they might be able to determine who had commissioned the vault's construction and when, which could provide crucial insight into the planning and motivation behind the entire scheme. This observation led to a new line of inquiry. Financial records were reviewed, looking for unusual expenditures or payments that might relate to construction or security installations. The investigation revealed that approximately 9 months earlier, around the time when the king's coronation was being planned, a significant payment had been made to a specialized security company. The payment was authorized from an account associated with the queen consort's household expenses, and it was described as being for private security enhancements and storage solutions. The security company was contacted and asked to provide details about the work they had performed. Their records showed that they had been contracted to install a climate-controlled secure storage space in a location within Buckingham Palace. Though the specific location was not detailed in their public records, the project manager remembered the job clearly because of its unusual nature and the emphasis placed on absolute discretion. He recalled that all instructions had come through intermediaries and that he had never met directly with whoever had commissioned the inflork. When pressed about payment and authorization, the project manager produced documentation, showing that the work had been approved and paid for through legitimate palace accounts. Everything had appeared proper and official at the time. He had assumed reasonably that this was a standard security upgrade being requested by someone with appropriate authority. The revelation that the secure space had been used to hide stolen items clearly shocked him, and he expressed willingness to cooperate fully with any investigation. This discovery was significant because it showed premeditation and planning. LZ, the hidden vault, had not been created impulsively, but had been commissioned months in advance, suggesting someone had anticipated needing a secure place to store items they intended to remove from the royal collection. The timing was also notable as it coincided with the period between Queen Elizabeth's death and King Charles's coronation, a time of transition when new household arrangements were being established. As the meeting continued, one of the palace officials raised a question that had been lurking beneath all their discussions. What would happen if the media discovered what they had found? The palace's ability to maintain confidentiality about such a significant matter was limited, as too many people now knew about the hidden items in the investigation. Someone might talk to journalists, or a staff member who had been questioned might share their story. The officials needed to prepare for the possibility that this situation would become public knowledge. The head of palace communications was brought into the meeting to discuss potential media strategies. She outlined several scenarios, each requiring different approaches. If the story leaked, they could either try to minimize it by describing it as a misunderstanding about proper storage of royal items, or they could get ahead of it by releasing a carefully worded statement acknowledging that items had been improperly relocated and were being returned to their rightful places. Neither option was ideal, but being prepared for different outcomes was essential. Lady Margaret made a passionate argument that the truth mattered more than protecting reputations or avoiding scandal. Queen Elizabeth II had lived her entire life with integrity and devotion to duty. She deserved to have her legacy protected and her possessions treated with proper respect. If that meant facing uncomfortable truths about what had happened after her death, then the royal family needed to have the courage to face those truths. Her words hung in the air, and several people in the room nodded in agreement. A decision was reached after several more hours of discussion. King Charles would have a private conversation with the Queen Consort, presenting her with the facts of what had been discovered and asking for her explanation. Depending on how that conversation went, decisions would be made about next steps. In the meantime, all of Queen Elizabeth's items would be carefully removed from the Queen Consort's apartments and returned to their proper places in the royal collection. The staff members who had been directly involved in moving the items would face disciplinary action, though the specific penalties would depend on their level of knowledge and intent. James was assigned to oversee the secure transfer of items back to the royal vaults. Over the next several days, he watched as conservators and archivists carefully packed each piece, documenting its condition and ensuring it would be properly preserved. The Coronation Robe received special attention, being examined minutely for any signs of damage or wear. Fortunately, whoever had taken it had at least ensured it was stored properly. And the robe appeared to be in the same excellent condition as when it had been placed in the hidden vault. As the items were being transferred, James had a conversation with Lady Margaret that he would remember for the rest of his life. She spoke about Queen Elizabeth's devotion to duty, and her understanding that she was not just a person, but the embodiment of an institution. The late Queen had always put the monarchy before her personal desires, understanding that she held her possessions in trust for the nation and for future generations. That was why finding her items hidden away had been so disturbing to Lady Margaret. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what royal heritage meant. The private meeting between King Charles and the Queen Consort took place on a rainy afternoon in early winter. James was not present, but he was on duty outside the room where it occurred. The meeting lasted for nearly 3 hours, and when it concluded, both the King and Queen Consort emerged, looking emotionally exhausted. No public statement was made about what had been discussed, but staff members who worked closely with both of them noticed a palpable tension in the days that followed. In the weeks after that meeting, subtle changes began appearing in palace protocols. New procedures were implemented for tracking and securing items from the royal collection. Access to storage areas was restricted and required multiple authorizations. Regular audits were scheduled to ensure all items remained in their designated locations. These changes were implemented quietly, without any public explanation. But those who understood their context recognized them as direct responses to what had been discovered. Sarah Mitchell and 2 other staff members were quietly dismissed from royal service. The official explanation given was that their positions were being eliminated as part of routine reorganization. But everyone in the palace knew the real reason. Sarah reportedly tried to fight her dismissal, claiming she had been made a scapegoat for decisions made by others, but her protests went nowhere. The palace's lawyers made it clear that she should consider herself fortunate not to be facing criminal charges, and she eventually accepted a settlement that included a strict confidentiality agreement. The Queen Consort's public schedule slowly returned to normal, though careful observers noted that she seemed more subdued than before. Her relationship with certain senior palace officials appeared strained, and she relied increasingly on a small circle of trusted advisors. Staff members who worked in her household reported that she had become more careful about how things were done, frequently asking for written authorization and documentation for decisions that previously would have been handled informally. King Charles never publicly acknowledged what had been discovered in his wife's apartments. However, those close to him noted changes in how he approached matters involving his mother's legacy. He became personally involved in decisions about which of Queen Elizabeth's possessions should be publicly displayed and which should remain in private family hands. He established a foundation dedicated to preserving royal history and ensuring that significant items would be properly maintained for future generations. James continued his service with the Royal Guard, though his experience during those tense weeks had changed him. He had seen firsthand how complex and politically fraught life within the palace could be. He had learned that loyalty sometimes meant making difficult choices and standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. The memory of opening that wardrobe and finding Queen Elizabeth's coronation robe would stay with him forever. A reminder that even in institutions steeped in tradition and protocol, human weaknesses and questionable decisions could create serious problems. Several months after the incident, James was standing guard in one of the palace's public galleries when a tour group passed by. The guide was pointing out a display that included one of Queen Elizabeth II's ceremonial robes, explaining its historical significance and the care taken to preserve such items for future generations. The tourists listened with obvious interest, taking photographs and asking questions. None of them had any idea of the drama that had unfolded behind the scenes, or how close those items had come to remaining hidden from public view. Lady Margaret eventually retired from royal service, though she remained connected to the palace as an informal advisor on matters involving the royal collection. In her farewell speech to staff members, she spoke about the importance of remembering that they were not just employees, but guardians of history. Every item in the royal collection, from the grandest crown to the smallest personal trinket, represented a piece of Britain's story. It was their responsibility to protect and preserve those items, not for themselves or for any individual, but for the nation and for generations yet to come. The full story of what had been discovered in the Queen Consort's apartments never became public knowledge in the way some had feared. Small hints and rumors circulated in the press occasionally, usually dismissed as palace gossip or exaggerated speculation. The confidentiality agreements and the general discretion of palace staff meant that the specific details remained closely guarded. Most people outside the palace walls never learned about the hidden vault, the coronation robe, or the systematic removal of Queen Elizabeth's possessions. For those who did know the truth, the incident served as a sobering reminder about the importance of proper protocols and the dangers of allowing personal relationships or emotions to override institutional responsibilities. The monarchy depended on public trust, and that trust could be damaged by even the appearance of impropriety. The items that had been hidden away were eventually returned to their rightful places, preserved and protected as they should have been all along. James often reflected on those extraordinary weeks and what they had taught him about loyalty, duty, and the complex realities of serving an ancient institution in modern times. He had done his job, following orders and maintaining the discretion expected of a royal guard. But he had also witnessed something that troubled him deeply: the exploitation of position and access to pursue goals that, whatever their motivation, had violated fundamental principles of trust and stewardship.